what use is relationism and relational analytics for social reformers? Social reform has been based, as you know, on many different ideologies and philosophies. You could argue that we are living in a world which has been socially reformed after the Reformation, starting around 1980. Up to 1980 or so, I would argue that Western society was largely based on the inheritance of the Reformation. Largely, not completely, certainly in the UK, not completely, but largely. If you went to Northern Europe, it was much more completely based on the fruit of the Reformation. If you go to Southern Europe, hardly any Reformation took place. So it depends what bit of the West you're talking about, right? But starting about 1980, there was a de-Reformation, biblically speaking, that started. And the de-Reformation that started shifted the basis of society to the modern Ayn Randian ideas of individualism and greed. You may remember certain very leading politicians saying, greed is good. Well, a society that believes that greed is good is certainly not a society that holds anything like biblical values, is it? A society that says there's no such thing as community. Do you remember? The statement said no such thing as community. It's certainly not a society that upholds biblical values. So you could argue that we live in a society that has been de-reformed, biblically speaking, since about the 1980s. You could look at China, and you can see China being reformed on the basis of Marxist or Maoist ideas up to roughly 1979 or 80. And then, of course, it was reformed on the basis of these capitalist ideas. Individualism, greed is good, no community, and so on and so forth, right? And now what we're seeing under President Xi is, of course, the re-reformation of society on the basis of going back to Maoist ideas. You could look at Japan and you can see that Japan was reformed after World War II so that they shed Japanese culture and adopted the American Constitution with American values, including, of course, capitalism and so on. You could look at Tanzania and you could see how under President Nyerere, that country was reformed from African tribal ideas to socialist ideas. So you can look at, throughout history, you can see many societies being reformed, so to speak, on many different bases. And the question we are asking today is it possible that relationism might be a basis for a new reformation of society? That's the question we're really asking, right? So if you're asking that question, the first question that arises, preliminary question that arises is, does society actually need reforming? Aren't we doing perfectly well? Why should we bother to reform? It's like asking a man or a woman who is well fed, do you need to eat? Well, yes, maybe sometime, but not just now, thank you very much, I'm full. So the first question to ask ourselves is there a need for social reform? You wouldn't be sitting here if your answer was no, but I think out there are many people who would say, no, this is going on perfectly happily, thank you very much, particularly if they belong to a certain class in society. Anyway, my talk has a very simple structure. I'm going to offer you some introductory remarks on which I've already started. We are then going to talk about what relationism is and what relational analytics are and the uses of these things. And then we're going to actually address the question with which I've started. Is that all right? So, my first introductory remark is in relation to myself. I come from a Hindu background. I'm a Hindu who follows Jesus. So I was born in India, I was brought up in India. I left India, I was brought up as a nationalist. And the only reason I left India was because I was kicked out of the country for political reasons. And I was extremely unhappy at being kicked out of India. I'm still extremely unhappy about having been kicked out of India. I'm still extremely unhappy about not being able to go back to India. And so the reason I'm here is because God kicked me out of India. But God had an agenda in kicking me out of India. And his agenda in kicking me out of India was to teach me about global politics and global finance and global economics and global technology, which I would never have learnt in India. And I ended up, through a series of circumstances, through a 17-year period of exile after not being able to finish my PhD, for reasons I won't go into. I ended up, after 17 years of exile, really wandering the wilderness, not knowing what I was doing, not knowing why I was in the mess I was in, working for the largest bank in the world, which I started working miraculously, in the most senior position that a non-Swiss had ever been appointed to up to that point. Not a non-white man or woman, but a non-Swiss had ever been appointed to up to that point. I won't go into the whole story because that's not the purpose today, but just to give you a glimpse into the background. So how come I can talk about this? Because for 15 years I worked for the largest bank in the world, and my job in what was then the largest bank in the world was to build a network across consultancy, across universities, across leading companies, in order to identify those areas that might represent a threat for the bank or an opportunity for the bank worth at least $1 billion. And if the threat or opportunity was worth $1 billion, then it was my job to organize a think tank around it. And the think tank meant drawing in people from all over the world, the best guys who could be found, men or women, so that we could discuss and debate that threat or that opportunity, write up one page of A4, which went to the board, so that the board could look at the opportunity or the threat and say, are we going to do something about this or not? And if we were going to do something about it, I might be involved, but it was not necessary, and it was not always the case that I was involved. Sometimes I was involved as a member of the team that was then beginning to do something about it. Sometimes I was chairing the group, sometimes a consultant to the group. It just depended. So the only reason I'm here able to talk about these issues is because God gave me a 15-year-long education in global economics, politics, finance, and society. And part of what was happening through this period was that I was beginning to think about, well, it started a long time ago, of course, when I started following Jesus at the age of 14. But at the age of 14, I was unlearning my Indian tradition, or examining my Indian tradition in the light of Scripture, to see how much and what I needed to change, because I loved my country, I loved my culture. And there were aspects of my culture which Scripture told me were not godly, and I had to understand what was not godly and what was not biblical, and then unlearn my culture, unlearn where I was coming from, which was tough enough. But then when I came to the West, I realized that my thinking as an academic was not biblical. And I had to start unlearning my academic learning, because most academic subjects, if you look at their history, were formed essentially in the period of intellectual history in the West, after the West had rejected the supremacy of Scripture. And so I was engaged at the same time as trying to understand global trends in politics, economics, and society, and technology, and so on. I was engaged in trying to declutter my brain from the ungodly assumptions of economics and politics and psychology and philosophy, which were my subjects at university, and try to rethink these disciplines from a biblical point of view. Because as Scripture tells us, you've got two references there. Part of God's agenda in bringing us to Himself is to reform our minds. In Luke 2:52 it says, Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So He grew first in wisdom. He didn't grow first in stature, interestingly, scripturally speaking. The most important thing was not that this baby grew up. Yeah, I'm a grandfather. It's very dear to me that my grandchildren grow up. Right? There are doctors and nurses and measurement systems whose job is to ensure that they're growing up. But scripturally speaking, the most important thing was not that Jesus grew up physically. Scripturally speaking, the most important thing was that he grew in wisdom. And what I had to understand was that I had not grown in wisdom. I had only grown in academic knowledge. I had only passed certain exams on the basis of certain assumptions and certain bits of information that had been given to me. But this was not wisdom. This was merely economics or psychology or politics or philosophy, as human beings had formed these disciplines on an ungodly basis. So, this period of rethinking these academic disciplines from a biblical point of view is what's behind me. Lots to be said about that, but I won't say anything more about that at the moment. I will simply draw your attention to the fact that we need to examine the language that we use in all our discussions. It's very common to talk about developing countries and developed countries. Now, is England a developed country or is it a newly undeveloping country? Is America a developed country or is it a now undeveloping country? What kind of language are we talking about? How do we use the words that we use? If you say you believe in God and you are talking to somebody who does not believe in God, don't assume that he or she is talking about your God. So when I meet an atheist, I always ask the person, what God do you not believe in? Because I don't know what you're talking about. Please tell me what God you don't believe in. You don't believe in the God of deism, you don't believe in the God of the Vedas, you don't believe in the God of Buddhism. Which God are you talking about? What God are you talking about? So let's be clear and precise about our language, is my first introductory comment to you. My next is, let's understand that politics always trumps economics. This is very difficult for me as an economist. As somebody who worked for a bank for a very long time, I thought money ran the world. And it's great to be able to think that money runs the world, especially if you're rich. But the fact of the matter is, politics will always trump economics. Politics will always trump technology. Politics will always trump social change. If you want evidence of that, you need only to look at India, which is a country full of resources of all natural sorts. We have mountains, we have deserts, we have subtropical climates in the south, we have gold, we have iron, we have coal, it doesn't matter, we have diamonds, it doesn't matter what natural resource you're talking about, we've got it. India is full of intelligent people, right? So how come India is a poor country? How come 1/3 of Silicon Valley consists of Indians, some of them in the top positions, and India can't get out of the bullock cart age? Why is it? It's because the country is run by looters and thieves. And the same applies to the Congo, the same applies to most other countries. You want to understand why a country without resources, such as Singapore or Switzerland, is as rich as it is, zero resources, you need to understand that it's because of the politics. Politics always trumps economics. Does politics trump technology? Well, you only need to go to China to find out that politics does trump technology. China succeeded in creating a little technological bubble around itself. If you go to Beijing or Shanghai or any of the Chinese cities, you will find that you cannot use any of the things that you would normally use. You can't use the internet. You can't use WhatsApp. You can't use your phone. Because they've built an electronic barrier around themselves. There used to be bamboo curtains and iron curtains. There is such a thing as an electronic curtain. And China has built an electronic curtain. So politics will always trump technology. Just because we are living in a relatively free society, we shouldn't assume that all societies have been, are, or are going to be free, including our own. So the institutions in the middle are, of course, what shape, moderate, mediate, whatever word you want to use, what's going on in society, what's going on in economics, what's going on in technology, represent them in politics, are shaped by politics. And so this is the mess that we are talking about when we say we are about reforming society. What are we about? We're reforming politics, yes, but we are also in the business of reforming technology. We're also in the business of reforming economics. We're also in the business of reforming society. And that's why it's so important what individuals do. I don't know what you do, but if you can think of a housewife of 35 with 2 kids, and you say to her, you need to think of yourself as a social reformer. She would say to you, you're out of your mind. I can hardly keep up with my 2 kids. I don't get enough sleep. What are you talking about? But every single follower of Jesus is, in principle, a social reformer. There is nothing so important as the way in which a mother brings up her children. If you don't believe that, think about the mother of Billy Graham. Think of the mother of President Putin. Think of the mother of President Xi. Do you know what any of their names are? Yet they changed society because of the way they brought up their children. That's why what every one of us does is so important. All of us have a role in social change, not just those who get engaged in, quotes, politics or, quotes, social reform. All of us are potentially social reformers. What do I mean? Because social reform happens in 4 spheres. You could argue that the highest importance is what happens in the actual battles of politics. Yes, that is true. But as I've been trying to suggest to you, perhaps the greatest significance is what happens in society. This is why every NGO leader, every teacher, every neighbor is so important. Okay, so there are many lies about in our society. And one of the jobs of any social reformer is to confront these lies, unmask these lies, and begin to confront and begin to communicate the truth about these lies, or the truth rather than the lie. One of the greatest lies in our society is that technology is neutral. You heard that? Technology is neutral. Technology is neutral. Technology is neutral. Well, actually, technology is not neutral. And the reason technology is not neutral is because every technology carries within it roots of ideology, and every technology has a consequence. And the consequence is that if you own that technology, you benefit from that technology to the extent the technology is, of course, obtains in the world, has an influence in the world. You benefit from that technology because you are going to make the money from it. And unless you're very socially responsible, you will end up having a lot of power as a result of that technology. So the essential question about technology is not what does this technology enable you to do. Just yesterday we had the announcement that an Australian research team has been able to successfully use silicon-based, not sophisticated electromagnetic fields and things like that, to get a 2-qubit system working in quantum computing. Why is this so important? Because all the other approaches to quantum computing have been using rather more sophisticated methods rather than silicon. And once it's on silicon, it's very easy because this is stuff we're all using. And if the qubits, quantum bits, which are used for quantum calculations, can be on these kinds of computers and not in some special machine or not in some vacuum or something like that, not in some very zero temperature or close to zero temperature environment in order to do the quantum computing, then of course it becomes very easily commercializable on our kinds of computers. It's only a 2-qubit system, but this 2-qubit system is 200 times faster than these computers, than the fastest of these computers we're using today. And you know and I know that 2 qubits is nothing. IBM and Google are already have invented 50 qubit systems and 72, if I remember correctly, qubit systems. And the IBM system is available for you as a normal person to just register and use and play with quantum computing. Great, wonderful. Wouldn't it be great to have a computer 200 times faster than what you've got in front of you? Of course, brilliant. But what matters about this technology is not really what it does. From the perspective of a social reformer, what matters is who owns this technology. What are they using the technology for? Are they using it simply to strengthen the electronic fence? Or are they using it to increase human freedom, prosperity, equality, and all that? What are they using it for is the important question from the perspective of the reformer. So it doesn't matter whether you're looking at 3D printing, which is very fascinating. The Chinese are now printing 10 houses a day and putting them up. 10 houses a day can be printed out and stuck up like stuck together like a giant Lego piece. You do 10 of those a day. Isn't that fascinating? You can also print guns, by the way. So the question is not what the technology does. The question is what is the governance system in place to ensure that we produce good things rather than nasty things that we don't particularly want. And so we could go through the whole thing and talk about, is it good to have self-replicating machines? Machines that reproduce like human beings or animals reproduce, because you're going to get to self-reproducing machines pretty quickly. What about self-developing machines? We now have machines that we have created, but these machines have developed their own languages, and we cannot understand these languages. Is it good to have such machines? Interesting questions for today's social reformers. Other questions? Who programs it? So I may own the quantum computer or whatever it is, 3D machine or whatever it is, but usually the owners are not the programmers, even if they invented this stuff, because by the time it's become big enough to be important, they are too big, personally, to be involved with the actual programming, right? And as you know, most fraud happens by insiders. It doesn't happen by hackers. Of course, hackers can get in and distort systems and misuse systems and so on. But most fraud does not happen by outsiders. Most fraud happens by insiders. So how can you, as the owner of this technology, or how can we, as a human community, help to ensure that the people who are doing the programming are doing it with the right values? Huge debate about that, as you know, because a lot of the artificial intelligence systems that are now being used for recruiting people for jobs have been demonstrated to be biased towards white males. Very good for white males, may not be so good for the rest who are not white males. And of course the question is, if we need only 4% of humanity, as we are told at the moment without quantum computing, we only need 4% of humanity to produce all the goods and services that the whole of humanity needs, then what do we do with the rest of the 96%? My brother, who's a conspiracy theorist, says that the whole of the global system is being rigged in such a way that humanity will gently, most of humans will gently be got rid of through cancers and things like that, which are being deliberately ignored. And research in relation to these is being deliberately suppressed. Now, you don't have to be a conspiracy theorist like him to really think about the question, what do we do with 96% of humanity if we only need 4% of humans to produce all the goods and services we need? That's a question for social reformers. It's a cartoonish way of underlining that. Can you read it? What is that thing seated next to us, says one computer to the other. The other computer replies, I'm not sure, but it appears to be some form of non-artificial unintelligence. So this is not the technologies of tomorrow, but the technologies of today would affect 14 trillion in wages and 1 billion jobs as they get rolled out. Okay. But what is the current impact of technology? The current impact of technology has been to increase wage inequality. Wage inequality. Is technology neutral? Now tell me technology is not neutral. Now this slide, of course, doesn't have anything necessarily to do with technology. It's to do with all kinds of other factors, tax regimes and political arrangements and so on and so forth. But according to Oxfam, last year 26 people owned as much as half of humanity. The year before that, the figures were about 64. I don't remember the exact figure, but it was something like 64, may have been 62. The year before that, it was about 128 or something, 129 or something like that. The year before that was 360 something. The year before that, it was 1,000 something. Now you heard Jonathan say that Scripture is against concentration of power. What would you say is the Scripture position on concentration of wealth? What would you say is the Scripture's position on the world's leading companies evading tax? And if it was only one company, you would say, well, throw them in jail, right? So it doesn't seem to be an individual disease, does it? And if you follow the financial news and financial crime and so on around the country and around the world, you see we are living in the middle of an epidemic of financial crime. While there are a lot of reformers trying to sort out the financial system and trying to make sure that we have transparency and trying to make sure that we have no possibilities for black money to be around and so on and so forth, we are also living in a world where there's increasing financial crime. So, that's Facebook. I have stopped using Facebook. And not primarily because of that, but really because of Libra. Tell me, should we be using Libra or should we not be using Libra? Not a question for discussion just now, but something to think about. You'll get copies of these slides if you wish, by the way, so don't bother to write all this down. You'll just, when you get them, scribble down some things I say which are not there, which may be interesting for you, but don't bother to scribble these down. So if these are the signs of crisis in our current system, what could we or should we be doing about it? The first thing to understand is that the world is based on a certain set of lies, and the first lie is, I politely call them assumptions, but they are actually lies, aren't they? Relationships are no more than political or economic connections. The second lie is that money is the most effective measure of value. And the third lie is relationships are no more than, the first is people are only decision-making units. And that's the basis of the entire discipline of economics, or one of the bases of the entire discipline of economics. Individuals are profit maximizing, or if you want to be very sophisticated, satisfaction maximizing decision-making units. The second is money is the most effective measure of value, and the third is relationships are no more than. But in reality, people are more than individuals. We are not individuals, we are persons. Yeah, as we were reminded by the story of creation, as we were reminded by Jonathan, we are not individuals, we are persons in relation. We are individuals in relationship. When Martin Luther said, "Here I stand, I can do no other," he was not striking a blow for individualism. He was striking a blow against tyranny, yes. But he then took responsibility for society. So individuals responsible for society is the paradigm of Scripture and is the paradigm of the Reformation. It's not individuals by themselves. Wealth is more than money, and society and community are more than connections. Okay, let's go on. So that's the basic problem, if you like, from an economic point of view. And that is the solution, if you like, from an economic point of view. How does relationism speak to that? Or what does relationism have to say about it? Essentially, the argument is that if you move from the current lies that dominate economics to the way of thinking that we call relationism, this is nothing less than a Copernican revolution. It's replacing the wrong ideas of the individual with the right ideas about persons. And if you do that, then everything falls into place. If you want to understand what's wrong with our education system, if you want to understand what's wrong with our economics, if you want to understand what's wrong with our lifestyle, including maybe our own lifestyle, not just the lifestyle of people out there, if you want to understand what's wrong with the way we think about possessions, about our health, put persons, not individuals, in the center, and all these things will fall into their right place. So what does relational thinking do? It gives you a different lens from which to look at the world. You're not looking at the world through I, me, and myself. You're looking at the world through relationships. And that's quite a change for most of us. I would say that since I got involved with understanding relational thinking, which was around 1980, when the book first came out, I read it around 1980, some of the material and so on. I don't know that I have still got this lens firmly on. I think I'm still learning to take the old individualist, etc. lens off, set of spectacles off, and put on a relational set of spectacles. I'm still learning it. As Ross Gittins, the economics editor of the Sydney Morning Herald put it, if relationships are so fundamental to us, how come we don't take them seriously? Well, the answer is very clear, because our entire education system is not based on relationships. Okay, it also gives us new goals and values and working practices, which is a consequence of seeing the world relationally. If you really begin to see the world relationally, you will begin to live relationally. Or as somebody put it, if you want to understand a society, look at their gods. Or if you want to understand the gods of a society, look at the society. So if you look at our society today, you might conclude that the real gods of our society are I, me, and myself. With knowledge, maybe, and power, maybe, and personal peace and comfort, maybe. You could argue that these four gods are the real gods of our civilization. Sorry, have I gone too far? No, that's it. So can a focus on something as ordinary as relationships really make a difference, is actually the question that's being asked. And the answer is basically look at the fruit. So you can look at relational healthcare, and you can look at relational pensions, and you can look at everything relationally if you really want to. We've been on a journey, Jubilee Center and other organizations trying to do that. We don't pretend we've got there perfectly or even substantially, but at least we've begun to make a start at it. And it's up to folk like you to actually take the thinking further and the action further. Here are some organizations that have grown out of the relational thinking movement. And you can see they cover all kinds of areas, including relational peace building. We're involved with trying to bring peace in North Korea at the moment, or peace between North Korea basically and the United States at the moment, on the basis of relational principles. So, obviously you'll get the slides so you can look at these later. So relational analytics. What is relational analytics? Well, relational analytics is actually a way of measuring relationships. So you can measure the relationship between yourself and your best friend, or your parents, or your children if you've got children, or your church, or your football club. If you're a company, you could measure the relationship between yourself and your investors, or your suppliers, or your regulators, the government, or the community. These are, of course, external relationships, but you could also measure internal relationships. You can measure the relationship between the board and its direct reports, or within a board, or across the different functions of a company. How well does the finance function relate to the marketing function, or production function, or whatever? You can measure the relationship between locations. You've got a location in Italy, you've got a location in Mexico. How do they relate to each other? How well do they connect? What is the quality of their relationship? This sounds very interesting. How do you actually do it? Well, something called the Relational Proximity Framework was created as a result of consultancy work done free for the relational thinking movement by somebody from McKinsey. And the result was, by the way, information is on the Relationships Foundation website and so on, the books, Relational Manager, whole lot of literature which you can read, some of which I'm sure you read, but there's a whole lot of other stuff to get your head around. But this is actually the framework. So you can see there are 5 dimensions represented in 2 different ways. One is more general on your right, and one is more detailed on your left. And there are drivers of a relationship, and there are sub-drivers of a relationship. So if you do the measurement, then you can see not only the drivers and how they score against each other, but you can see the sub-drivers and how they're influencing the overall drivers. In other words, having done the analysis, you can tell that the relationship between me and you, Charlie, is a good relationship in terms of, let's say, continuity and commonality. We won't get into the terminology just now, okay? Just to understand the principle. My relationship with Charlie, let us say, is doing fine on continuity and commonality, but actually isn't doing that well on multiplexity. Okay? So I get an analysis of the relationship, what is working in this relationship, and what is not working so well in this relationship. Is that useful? Well, it can be just an exercise. Or you can say, oh, now I understand where this relationship is working and where this relationship is not working and why. And because I now understand where this relationship is not working and why it's not working, I can do something about that in a targeted way. If you're a company, you could say, I now know how to get maximum return for minimum investment in terms of improving this relationship, because I now know what to set right in this relationship between the unit in Mexico and the unit in Italy, or investors in the company, or whatever, different levels of the company, or whatever it is. So that's basically what the measurement system does for us. One quick slide, which may be helpful to get some clarity around one particular thing that confuses people. There is something called the Global Trust Index, which is developed by some organization or the other, which I see from time to time. Scores have gone up on the Global Trust or down on the Global Trust Index. Great. So what should we be doing if the trust index shows that global trust is going down? We should be working on improving trust. Well, yes, but how? This chart or graph or whatever you want to call it, figure in front of you, will explain to you that really the problem in trust or the improvement in trust comes about because of something outside the central pillar. It comes about because of things that we're doing on the outside. Just as if you chase happiness, you're very unlikely to get it. If you chase improvement in trust, you're very unlikely to get it. Trust is a consequence, happiness is a result, and it's a result of doing many other things right. So trust is a consequence of getting all relational values and relational proximity worked out in balance. If you get them in balance, you're going to get trust. You don't get them in balance, you're not going to get trust. That's our view anyway, within the movement. So there's relational analytics in the website of relational analytics, which will tell you more about it if you're interested. There's another slide from it. We focus mainly on organizational relationships, not on personal ones, but you can use the same framework for your personal relationships. I did, and it helped my relationships hugely. Okay, so what can you do with relationism and relational analytics as social reformers? I want to suggest to you one or two quick things, and then you can decide whether what I'm talking about really makes sense. Most reform efforts fail because reformers go about their reform in ways or by using means that are counter to the proclaimed goals of that Reformation. Classic example of this, French Revolution. What was the French Revolution about? Liberty, equality, fraternity, right? How did they go about the Reformation? How did they go about the revolution? Did the way they go about the revolution demonstrate the qualities of liberty, equality, and fraternity? Liberty may be, equality may be, fraternity? Was Robespierre a shining example of somebody who practiced fraternity? You could take Marxism, you can take socialism, you can take any of these isms. You could even take the Protestant Reformation and ask the same question. Were the reformers always exhibiting biblical values? Yeah? It's an interesting question to ask. So how come these guys who were so totally focused on reforming their societies went about it not always the right way? How come? And how can we prevent ourselves from falling into the same trap? I suggest to you that relational analytics is a way of keeping ourselves honest. If you're using the analytics on ourselves, as individuals, as families, as an organization, it will help to keep us honest. It will help to keep us on track. Are we really doing things using the right means, being the right kind of people in that? Secondly, it's a means of helping you improve. So you can see your score yesterday was 60, today it's 61. Pretty good. Yesterday's score was 60, today it's 59. Hey, wake up, something's going wrong. Right? Maybe if the reformers had had this, they would have focused a bit more on improving themselves and not just on reforming society. So it's a means of keeping your party, whatever your party is, on track, yourself as well, not just on the goal. But very interestingly, measurements can be a Trojan horse for social reform. If you want to reform the school system and you can get in and start measuring relationships in school, then without talking about it, just by holding the mirror up on relationships in school, and how relationships in school are doing, you focus attention on the fact that actually relationships aren't as good as they need to be. In a business, that is education, which is primarily the result of good relationships. I don't know if you realize, but if you look back on your own school career or your college career, you will see that the subjects in which you did best generally were those subjects in which you admired the teacher, respected the teacher, got on well with the teacher, liked the teacher. Not always, I know it's not always. But the most influential, educationally, the most influential people in your life were those people you had the best relationship with. So you want to change the education system, you can produce a government policy, of course you can. But how is it being delivered on the ground? You want bottom-up change? You need the right policies. I'm not saying you don't need the right policy. Of course you need the right policies. But you want change on the ground, not a bad way to do it, even in the absence of the right kind of policy. Because you start holding the mirror up, people start seeing what's wrong, and they say, hey, acne, something needs to be done about it. So whether it's education, and we've seen this in practice, I'm not giving a theoretical example, relational schools, if you've not followed their work, you will see it's absolutely exploded. They only started 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Started 5 years ago with 10 schools in the UK. Today it's hundreds of schools in the UK. It's in South Africa, it's in Australia, it's just starting, it's in Netherlands, just starting in the US. 5 years. Pretty minuscule budget. Wasn't money that's driving it, isn't money that's driving it. Of course you need money, but it isn't the availability of money that's driving it, it's demand. People see it and they want it. And the same applies to all these other areas. We could use this in other areas. Well, my time is up. Otherwise I'd go on to talk about lots of other things.